Timber Ridge Camp was nestled deep in the Pacific Northwest, surrounded by dense forests and serene lakes. Established in the 1950s, it was a place where children came to escape the modern world and immerse themselves in nature. The camp was renowned for its adventure programs and friendly counselors, who made every summer unforgettable. But one summer, a darkness crept into Timber Ridge, bringing with it a chilling mystery. Among the campers that year were three friends, Alex, Emma, and Chris. They had been coming to Timber Ridge since they were kids and considered it their second home. This summer was special. It was their last before heading off to college, and they intended to make every moment count. The first few days were filled with the usual activities: swimming, hiking, and late-night campfires. The friends relished the freedom and the fresh forest air. But one evening, as they sat around the campfire, the head counselor, Mr. Harris, shared a story that sent shivers down their spines. "Has anyone heard about the legend of the Shadow Man?" Mr. Harris began, his voice low and grave. The campers leaned in closer, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. "The story dates back to the early days of the camp," he continued. "It is said that a man once lived in these woods, a recluse who shunned human contact. He was a skilled hunter and knew every inch of the forest. One night, during a terrible storm, he vanished without a trace. Some say he was taken by the spirits of the forest. Others believe he became one with the shadows. Since then, campers have reported seeing a dark figure at the edge of the woods, watching and waiting." Emma scoffed, trying to hide her unease. "It's just a story, right?" Mr. Harris smiled, but his eyes remained serious. "Believe what you will. Just remember, if you see the Shadow Man, never follow him into the woods." That night, as they returned to their cabin, the story lingered in their minds. Chris, the most adventurous of the trio, suggested they explore the woods and see if there was any truth to the legend. "Are you serious?" Alex asked, his voice tinged with apprehension. Mr. Harris said not to go into the woods. "Come on," Chris urged. "It's our last summer here. Don't you want to have a story to tell?" Reluctantly, Alex and Emma agreed. The next night, armed with flashlights and a map, they set out after curfew, determined to uncover the truth. The forest was eerily quiet. The only sounds were their footsteps and the occasional hoot of an owl. As they ventured deeper, the trees seemed to close in around them, blocking out the moonlight. "I don't like this," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "We should go back. We're almost there," Chris replied, consulting the map. "Just a little further." Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the trees, and their flashlights flickered. The friends froze as a dark figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and shadowy, its features indistinguishable. "Is that?" Alex began, his heart pounding, before he could finish. The figure turned and moved deeper into the woods, gliding effortlessly through the underbrush. "Let's follow it," Chris said, already stepping forward. "Are you crazy?" Emma hissed. "Mr. Harris warned us not to?" But Chris was already moving, and Alex, torn between fear and curiosity, followed. Emma, not wanting to be left alone, reluctantly trailed behind them. The figure led them deeper into the forest, where the trees grew denser and the air colder. The shadows seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing in the corners of their vision. Despite the growing sense of dread, they pressed on, determined to solve the mystery. After what felt like hours, they emerged into a small clearing. In the center stood an ancient, crumbling stone altar, covered in moss and vines. The shadowy figure stood beside it, motionless. "What is this place?" Alex whispered, his voice barely audible, before anyone could answer. The figure raised a hand and pointed to the altar. The friends hesitated, but Chris, driven by an unseen force, stepped forward. "Chris, don't!" Emma cried, reaching out to stop him, but it was too late. As Chris touched the altar, the ground beneath them began to tremble, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the clearing. The shadowy figure dissolved into the air, and the forest around them seemed to come alive with a sinister energy. "We need to get out of here," Alex shouted, grabbing Chris and pulling him away from the altar. The friends turned and ran, their flashlights bobbing wildly as they navigated the dark forest. The growling grew louder, and the shadows seemed to reach out, trying to ensnare them. Panic surged through them as they stumbled over roots and underbrush. Desperate to find their way back to camp. Finally, they burst out of the forest and into the open grounds of Timber Ridge. They collapsed onto the grass, gasping for breath, their hearts racing. What the hell was that? Emma panted, her eyes wide with fear. I don't know, Chris admitted, his voice shaking, but we need to tell Mr. Harris. The next morning, they found Mr. Harris and recounted their terrifying encounter. His face grew pale as he listened, and when they finished, he nodded solemnly. You shouldn't have gone into the woods, he said. The Shadow Man is not just a legend. He's a guardian of this forest, and that altar you found is an ancient relic. It's said to hold a powerful, dark energy, and disturbing it can have dire consequences. The friends exchanged worried glances. What do we do now? Alex asked. Mr. Harris sighed. We must perform a cleansing ritual to appease the spirits of the forest. You three will need to help. It's the only way to ensure your safety and the safety of the camp. That night, under a full moon, Mr. Harris led them back to the clearing. They carried candles, herbs, and sacred objects, following his instructions closely. As they reached the altar, the air grew heavy with an ominous presence. Mr. Harris began the ritual, chanting in a language none of them understood. The candles flickered, and the shadows danced wildly around them. The friends stood in a circle, holding hands, their fear palpable. As the ritual progressed, the ground trembled once more, and the shadows seemed to recoil. A blinding light erupted from the altar, illuminating the clearing. The growling ceased, and the oppressive energy lifted, replaced by a sense of calm. It's done, Mr. Harris said, his voice weary but relieved. The spirits are appeased. The friends returned to camp, exhausted but safe. They had faced the darkness of Timber Ridge and survived, but the experience left an indelible mark on them. The legend of the Shadow Man was no longer just a story, it was a reality. They had lived. As summer came to an end, they said their goodbyes to Timber Ridge, promising to return one day, but they knew that the forest held secrets that were best left undisturbed. The shadows of Timber Ridge would always linger in their memories, a reminder of the night they ventured into the unknown and faced the darkness within. Whispering Pines Summer Camp had always been a place of joy and laughter for kids. Nestled deep in the forest, it promised adventures, friendships, and memories that would last a lifetime. But, as the sun set on the first day of the new season, a chilling breeze whispered through the trees, hinting at something far more sinister. The camp had a long history, spanning over 5 decades. Generations of children had spent their summers there, learning to swim, canoe, and hike the dense, sprawling woods. Yet, beneath the veneer of happy memories, there was a story often shared in hushed tones by the campfire, a legend of the lost children of Whispering Pines. According to the tale, 30 years ago, a group of campers went missing one night. They were last seen heading into the forest on a dare, planning to spend the night near the old, abandoned mine. Despite extensive searches, no trace of them was ever found. The camp closed for a year, reopening with a new staff who quickly brushed the story aside, labeling it a myth. But the older counselors knew better. They knew the woods held secrets, and the past had a way of creeping into the present. This summer, the camp was abuzz with excitement as campers arrived. Among them were 5 friends: Emily, Jack, Sarah, Tom, and Lucas. They were inseparable, having grown up together and attended the camp for years. As they settled into their cabins, they laughed off the ghost stories, confident that they were just tales to scare the new kids. The first few days were filled with typical camp activities: swimming, archery, and arts and crafts. The friends spent their evenings around the campfire, toasting marshmallows and sharing stories. One night, as the flames flickered and the shadows danced, a new counselor named Ethan decided to entertain them with the legend of the lost children. The story goes, Ethan began, his voice low and dramatic, that those children ventured into the forest, never to return. Some say their spirits still roam the woods, looking for a way back home. And if you listen closely on a quiet night, you can hear their whispers carried by the wind. Emily rolled her eyes, but Sarah, always the curious one, leaned in. Has anyone ever tried to find them? She asked. Ethan shrugged. Many have tried, but the forest is dense and treacherous. People get lost easily, and strange things happen out there. The last group that went looking swore they heard voices and saw shadows moving between the trees. That night, as they headed back to their cabins, the friends couldn't shake the eerie feeling the story had left them with. Jack, the group's skeptic, tried to lighten the mood. It's just a story, guys. There's no such thing as ghosts. But Sarah was intrigued. What if we tried to find the old mine? She suggested. We could prove once and for all that there's nothing out there. Reluctantly, the others agreed. They planned to venture into the forest the following night, armed with flashlights and a map Ethan had left behind. As darkness fell, they slipped away from their cabins and into the woods, their path illuminated by the moonlight. Filtering through the canopy, the forest was eerily silent, the usual sounds of wildlife absent. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Strange shapes seemed to move at the edge of their vision, disappearing when they turned to look. Lucas, usually the bravest, began to feel uneasy. Maybe this isn't such a good idea, he muttered. But Sarah was determined. We're almost there, she insisted, pointing to the map. Just a little further. They pressed on, finally reaching the entrance to the old mine. It was a gaping, black maw in the earth, overgrown with vines and surrounded by ancient, twisted trees. The air was colder here, and the silence was absolute. Emily shivered. This place gives me the creeps. Let's just take a quick look and go back. They ventured inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The walls were damp and covered in moss, and the floor was uneven and treacherous. As they moved deeper, they found remnants of old mining equipment and graffiti from previous explorers. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the tunnel. Help us. It was faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. The friends froze, their blood running cold. Did you hear that? Tom whispered, his voice shaking. Let's get out of here, Jack said, backing towards the entrance. But Sarah was transfixed, staring into the darkness. We can't leave now. What if someone really needs help? Reluctantly, they followed her deeper into the mine. The air grew colder, and the feeling of being watched intensified. The whispers grew louder, echoing off the walls. They rounded a corner, and came face to face with a horrifying sight. 5 ghostly figures stood before them, their eyes hollow and their faces twisted in eternal torment. The lost children of Whispering Pines. Help us, they repeated, their voices a haunting chorus. Panic surged through the group. They turned to run, but the way back seemed to twist and change, the mine becoming a labyrinth of darkness. Lucas tripped and fell, his flashlight clattering away. In the dim light, he saw one of the ghostly figures reaching out to him, its hands skeletal and cold. We have to get out of here, Jack screamed, grabbing Lucas and pulling him to his feet. But the spirits were relentless, their whispers growing more desperate. Stay with us, join us. The friends ran blindly through the tunnels, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The mine seemed to close in around them, the walls shifting and narrowing. Emily screamed as a ghostly hand brushed her shoulder, its touch freezing cold. They burst out of the mine and into the forest, the night air a shock to their senses. But the whispers followed them, echoing through the trees. Help us. Desperate and disoriented, they stumbled through the woods. The path back to camp seemingly vanished. The forest seemed alive, shadows moving and whispering. Jack tripped and fell, his flashlight flickering out. The others stopped to help him, but the sense of dread was overwhelming. We're lost, Tom said, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah looked around, her eyes wide with fear. We have to keep moving. We can't stay here. But the forest had other plans. As they tried to find their way, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Shapes moved in the darkness, closing in on them. Suddenly, Lucas screamed. A shadowy figure had grabbed his arm, its grip icy and unyielding. Help me, he cried, struggling to break free. The others tried to pull him away, but the figure's grip was too strong. With a final, desperate effort, Lucas was torn from their grasp and dragged into the darkness, his screams fading into the night. Panic-stricken, the remaining friends ran, their only thought to escape the forest. But the whispers were relentless, and the shadows seemed to follow them. One by one, they were picked off, dragged into the darkness by the ghostly figures. In the end, only Sarah remained, stumbling through the woods, her flashlight flickering. The whispers were deafening now, surrounding her. "Join us. Help us." Exhausted and terrified, Sarah collapsed to the ground, her flashlight finally going out. In the darkness, she felt cold hands close around her, pulling her into the shadows. The next morning, the camp was abuzz with concern. The friends had not returned, and a search party was organized. But despite hours of searching, no trace of them was found. Whispering Pines Summer Camp closed once again, the legend of the lost children growing even darker. Years later, the camp reopened under new management. The stories were dismissed as mere legends, and the new generation of campers arrived, eager for adventure. But deep in the forest, the whispers still echoed, and the shadows still moved, waiting for the next group of curious souls to venture too far into the darkness. For in Whispering Pines, the past never truly dies, and the lost children are always waiting, their whispers carried by the wind, a chilling reminder that some secrets are best left buried. Camp Ravenwood was a hidden gem in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, known for its pristine lakes, towering pine trees, and the sense of camaraderie it fostered among its campers. Generations of families sent their children there, confident that they would return with tales of adventure and newfound friendships. But as summer approached this year, the camp was about to open a new, darker chapter in its history. The camp had been closed for nearly a decade, following a tragic accident that claimed the lives of 2 counselors. The details of the incident were murky, but the camp's reputation never quite recovered. New management had taken over, determined to restore Ravenwood to its former glory. They renovated the cabins, cleared the overgrown trails, and advertised the camp's reopening with great fanfare. Among the first group of new campers were 4 friends: Mia, Jake, Lily, and Eric. They had been friends since kindergarten and were excited to spend their summer together at Ravenwood. The camp looked beautiful, and the promise of adventures in the wilderness thrilled them. From the moment they arrived, everything seemed perfect. The counselors were friendly, the activities were fun, and the other campers quickly became friends. They spent their days swimming in the lake, hiking the scenic trails, and sitting around the campfire at night, sharing ghost stories and toasting marshmallows. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the camp, a senior counselor named Mark gathered everyone around the fire for a special story. He had been at Ravenwood during the time of the accident and had agreed to return to help with the reopening. "Have you ever heard about the forgotten cabin?" Mark asked, his voice low and filled with mystery. The campers leaned in closer, intrigued. "It's an old story," he continued, "dating back to the early days of the camp. There was a cabin deep in the woods, far from the main campgrounds. It was said to be haunted, and no one knew why. But those who ventured there never returned the same. Some said it was cursed. Others believed it was a portal to another world." Mia shivered, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders. Jake, ever the skeptic, smirked. "Sounds like a fairy tale," he said. Mark shrugged. "Believe what you want, but the cabin is real. I've seen it myself. It's abandoned now, but some nights, you can see a light flickering inside, as if someone or something is still there." That night, as they returned to their cabins, the story lingered in their minds. Eric, the adventurous one, was the first to suggest they find the cabin. "It could be fun," he said. "Just think of the stories we could tell when we get back." Lily, usually the cautious one, surprised them by agreeing. "Let's do it. What's the worst that could happen?" The next day, they packed their backpacks with snacks, flashlights, and a map they borrowed from the camp's office. They planned to set out after lunch, hoping to be back before dark. The hike was beautiful, the dense forest filled with the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves. The path they followed was overgrown, clearly not used for many years. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the atmosphere began to change. The air grew colder, and an eerie silence replaced the once lively sounds of the forest. "Do you think this is a good idea?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're almost there," Eric said, checking the map. "Just a little further." Finally, they arrived at a clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its wooden walls weathered by time. The windows were broken, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. Despite its condition, there was an undeniable aura about the place that sent a chill down their spines. Jake stepped forward, pushing the door open with a creak. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, filled with broken furniture and cobwebs. The air was thick with the smell of decay. "Looks like no one's been here for years," Lily said, shining her flashlight around Dot. As they explored, they found an old journal hidden under a pile of debris. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but the writing was still legible. It belonged to a boy named Thomas, who had been at the camp many years ago. The entries started out normal descriptions of camp activities, friends, and adventures, but as they read further, the tone changed. Thomas wrote about strange noises at night, shadows moving in the woods, and a feeling of being watched. July 15th. Something is wrong here. At night, I hear whispers outside my window, but when I look, there's no one there. The other kids don't believe me. They say I'm just trying to scare them. July 20th. I found the cabin today. It looks abandoned, but I feel like I'm being watched. I don't want to go back, but something keeps drawing me to it. July 25th. I can't sleep. The whispers are getting louder. I saw a light in the cabin last night. I think something is inside. The last entry was dated July 30th. I'm going to the cabin tonight. I need to know what's inside. If I don't come back, tell my family I love them. The friends looked at each other, a sense of unease settling over them. We should leave, Mia said, her voice trembling, but Eric was already heading towards the door. We came this far. We can't turn back now. Reluctantly, they followed him outside. As they stood in the clearing, they noticed the sun beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ground. We need to hurry, Jake said. We don't want to be out here after dark. As they turned to leave, a light flickered in the window of the cabin. They froze, staring in disbelief. The light grew brighter, and they heard a faint whispering, just like Thomas had described. Let's get out of here, Lily said, her voice urgent. But before they could move, the door of the cabin slammed shut with a loud bang. The whispering grew louder, surrounding them. Panic surged through the group as they ran into the woods, desperate to get back to the main camp. The forest seemed to close in around them. The once familiar path now twisted and unfamiliar. Shadows moved between the trees, and the whispering followed them, growing louder with each step. Mia stumbled and fell, scraping her knee. Eric helped her up, but they had lost sight of Jake and Lily. Where are they? Mia cried, her voice filled with fear. We'll find them, Eric said, trying to stay calm. We just need to keep moving. They pressed on, their flashlights flickering as the batteries began to die. The forest seemed endless, and the whispering was relentless. Finally, they burst into a clearing. But it wasn't the camp, it was the cabin again, standing ominously in the center. We're going in circles, Eric said, frustration and fear evident in his voice. The door of the cabin creaked open, and a figure stepped out. It was Thomas, or at least, it looked like him. His eyes were hollow, and his skin was pale and translucent. Help me, he whispered, his voice echoing with the voices of many others. You have to help us. Mia and Eric backed away, their hearts pounding. We need to go, Mia said, her voice shaking, but Thomas reached out, his hand passing through Eric's arm like mist. You can't leave, he said. Not until you help us. The friends turned and ran, not daring to look back. The forest seemed to shift and change around them, the path never the same. They finally saw the lights of the main camp in the distance, and stumbled into the clearing. Exhausted and terrified, the counselors rushed to them, concerned and confused. What happened? Where are Jake and Lily? Mark asked, his face pale. They're still out there, Mia said, tears streaming down her face. We saw Thomas. He tried to trap us. Mark's expression turned grim. We need to find them. Everyone, gather in groups and spread out. We can't leave anyone behind. The search party set out, combing the woods for hours. They found no trace of Jake and Lily, and as dawn broke, hope began to fade. Mark gathered the remaining campers, his face lined with worrying. We'll keep looking, he said, but for now, we need to stay together. No one goes into the woods alone. Days turned into weeks, and the search continued. The story of the forgotten cabin spread through the camp, but no one dared to venture into the woods again. The whispers still echoed at night, a chilling reminder of the friends they had lost. Mia and Eric tried to return to normal, but the experience had changed them. They couldn't forget the look in Thomas's eyes or the feeling of being watched. They knew the forest held secrets that were best left undiscovered. As summer came to an end, the camp prepared to close for the season. The remaining campers left with heavy hearts, and the new management decided to shut down Ravenwood for good. The stories and the memories were too much to bear. Years later, the camp remained abandoned, the cabins overgrown with vines and the paths reclaimed by the forest. But on quiet nights, if you listen closely, you could still hear the whispers of the lost souls, carried on the wind, calling out for help that would never come. For Ravenwood was a place where the past never truly stayed buried, and the spirits of the forgotten would always linger. The final day of senior year at Pine Ridge High School was supposed to be a day of celebration. Graduating students were eager to leave behind the halls that had shaped their teenage years. Among them was a group of friends: Jenna, Max, Olivia, and Sam. They had made a pact to stick together no matter what, and today was no exception. As the school day drew to a close, they decided to pull one last prank on the strictest teacher in the school, Mr. Dawson, who had a reputation for his severe detentions. Their plan was simple: sneak into the old wing of the school after hours and set off the fire alarms. The old wing, once a bustling part of the school, had been abandoned years ago due to structural issues. It was said to be haunted, with stories of strange noises and ghostly apparitions circulating among students. But the friends dismissed these tales as mere superstitions. As the final bell rang, they gathered their supplies and made their way to the old wing. The building was dark and foreboding, its windows cracked and walls covered in ivy. The air was thick with the scent of mold and decay. Jenna, always the bravest, pushed open the creaking door, and they stepped inside. "Let's get this over with," Max said, trying to mask his nervousness. They moved through the dimly lit hallways, their flashlights casting eerie shadows. The atmosphere was oppressive, and the silence was deafening. As they reached the center of the old wing, they heard a distant, faint sound of soft, rhythmic tapping. "Did you hear that?" Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. "Probably just the wind," Sam replied. Though he didn't sound convinced, they continued onward, reaching the main hallway where the fire alarms were located. As they prepared to set off their prank, the tapping grew louder, echoing through the empty corridors. Jenna turned to see a figure standing at the end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light. "Who's there?" she called out, but there was no response. The figure moved closer, revealing itself to be an old man in outdated clothes. His face was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through them. The friends froze in fear, their flashlights trembling in their hands. "Leave this place," the man said in a raspy voice. "You don't belong here." Before they could react, the man disappeared, leaving behind an unsettling silence. The friends exchanged terrified glances, their bravado shattered. "We need to get out of here," Max said, his voice shaking. They turned to leave, but the door they had entered through was now locked. Panic set in as they tried to find another exit, but every door and window was sealed tight. The tapping resumed, louder and more insistent, reverberating through the walls. "What's happening?" Olivia cried, tears streaming down her face. Suddenly, the hallway lights flickered on, illuminating the dilapidated surroundings. The walls were covered in old photographs of students, but their faces were blurred and distorted. The friends realized they were not alone. Shadowy figures moved in the periphery of their vision, whispering unintelligible words. Jenna felt a cold hand on her shoulder and turned to see a young girl with long, tangled hair and empty eyes. The girl pointed to a classroom door at the end of the hall. "Go there," she whispered, her voice like the rustling of leaves. With no other options, the friends followed the girl's direction and entered the classroom. Inside, they found a dusty, forgotten room with desks and chairs arranged in neat rows. On the blackboard was a single word scrawled in chalk: "Detained." The door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. The room grew colder, and the whispers grew louder. The friends huddled together, their fear palpable. "This can't be real," Sam muttered, his breath visible in the frigid air. The whispers coalesced into a voice, low and menacing. "You will pay for your transgressions." The friends watched in horror as the room began to change. The walls closed in, the desks and chairs decayed into dust, and the air became thick with the stench of rot. They were no longer in a classroom but a dark, claustrophobic cell. One by one, the friends began to experience visions horrifying, scenes of their deepest fears and regrets. Jenna saw herself trapped in a coffin, buried alive. Max was surrounded by fire, unable to escape. Olivia faced a shadowy figure that whispered her darkest secrets, and Sam was pursued by unseen monsters in an endless maze. They screamed and cried for help, but their voices were swallowed by the darkness. Hours passed, though it felt like an eternity. The visions eventually faded, leaving them physically unharmed but mentally shattered. The cell door creaked open, revealing the old man from before. His expression was one of pity and anger. "You have learned your lesson," he said. "Leave this place and never return." The friends stumbled out of the cell, disoriented and traumatized. The old wing was now silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. They found the exit door unlocked and hurried out into the fresh air, grateful to be free. As they walked away from the old wing, they swore never to speak of what had happened, but the experience had changed them. The once inseparable friends drifted apart, unable to shake the horrors they had faced. The last day of school had become a nightmare that haunted them for the rest of their lives. A tragic reminder that some places are better left undisturbed and some pranks are better left unplayed. Ridgefield High School was a hive of activity on the last day before summer break. Students buzzed with excitement, eager to leave behind the stress of exams and enjoy the start of their vacation. Among them were four friends: Jake, Emma, Lucas, and Ava. They were planning one last adventure to mark the end of their high school journey. Rumors had long circulated about the school's underground tunnels, which were supposedly used during the school's early years. They had been sealed off for decades after a series of mysterious accidents. The tunnels were said to hold secrets, and the friends decided that exploring them would be the perfect way to cap off their senior year. "We should go see if the rumors are true," Jake suggested, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "It'll be an adventure." Emma, usually the cautious one, hesitated. "It sounds dangerous. Are we sure we want to do this?" "Come on, Emma," Lucas said. "We've heard about these tunnels for years. It's time we found out what's down there." As the final bell rang and the school started to empty, the group slipped away from the festivities. They made their way to the storage room in the basement, where they knew the entrance to the tunnels was located. Jake had managed to find an old key hidden in a forgotten drawer, and with a bit of effort, they unlocked the door. The air in the storage room was musty and filled with the smell of old paper and mildew. The narrow staircase leading down was coated in dust, and the walls were covered in peeling paint. Flashlights in hand, they descended into the darkness, their footsteps echoing eerily. "This is so creepy," Ava said, shivering despite the warm weather outside. The tunnel was narrow and winding, with low ceilings and uneven floors. The walls were covered in old graffiti and rusted pipes. As they walked, the temperature seemed to drop, and the air grew colder. "This place gives me the chills," Emma said, clutching her flashlight tighter. They reached a large, rusted door with a heavy lock. Lucas pulled out a set of tools and, with some effort, managed to pry the door open. Inside, they found what appeared to be an old, abandoned control room. Old machinery and dusty panels lined the walls. "This must be where they monitored the old systems," Jake said, examining the room. Suddenly, a loud clanging noise echoed through the tunnel. They froze, their hearts racing. "What was that?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. Before anyone could respond, the lights in the control room flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. The friends fumbled with their flashlights, but the beams seemed weak and unreliable. "Stay calm," Lucas said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We need to find a way out." As they moved to leave, they noticed something strange. The door they had entered through was now sealed shut. Panic set in as they tried to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. "Help? Is anyone there?" Jake shouted, but there was no response. The air grew thick and oppressive, and they began to hear strange mechanical noises, like gears grinding and machines whirring. The old machinery in the control room seemed to come to life, though there was no visible source of power. "What's happening?" Ava cried out, her voice filled with fear. The friends were trapped in the room, surrounded by the sounds of malfunctioning equipment. The lights flickered again, and they saw fleeting glimpses of shadows moving across the walls. The sense of being watched grew stronger. "Look," Emma pointed to a small window in the control room. "There's a light outside. Maybe we can signal for help." They gathered around the window, waving their flashlights and shouting for help. But the noise from the machinery was so loud that their voices were drowned out. Hours passed, and the friends grew increasingly desperate. Exhausted and frightened, they slumped to the floor, trying to stay calm. Suddenly, the machinery stopped, and the room fell silent. The door creaked open slowly, and the friends stumbled out into the darkness of the tunnel. The air was still cold, but there was no sign of the oppressive atmosphere they had experienced before. They made their way back to the storage room and up the stairs. Emerging into the basement, the storage room was back to its usual state, and the entrance to the tunnels was closed off, as if it had never been opened. The friends were shaken, but relieved to be back in the light. They never spoke of their experience to anyone. Ridgefield High School continued its usual routines, but the group never forgot their terrifying adventure in the abandoned tunnels. The old control room remained a mystery, its secrets hidden from the world. For Jake, Emma, Lucas, and Ava, the last day of school would always be remembered as the day they faced their fears and uncovered a part of the school's dark history that was meant to remain forgotten. Elmwood High School was abuzz with excitement. It was the last day of school before graduation, and the seniors were eager to leave their mark. Among them were Jessica, Daniel, Megan, and Kyle, a close-knit group who had been friends since freshman year. They decided to explore the old, abandoned wing of the school, which was rumored to be haunted. The abandoned wing had been shut down for decades, ever since a tragic fire claimed the lives of several students and a teacher. The surviving students often whispered about strange sounds and ghostly apparitions, but the tales were dismissed as urban legends. Jessica, the fearless leader, convinced her friends that it was the perfect opportunity to uncover the truth. "We'll be legends if we find anything," Jessica said with a grin, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Armed with flashlights and a video camera, the group slipped away from the end-of-year celebrations and made their way to the sealed-off wing. The door creaked open, revealing a long, dark hallway covered in dust and cobwebs. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. "This place is creepy," Megan whispered, shivering despite the warm June air. "Don't be a wimp," Kyle teased, but his voice lacked its usual bravado. They ventured deeper into the hallway, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the peeling wallpaper. The atmosphere grew colder, and a sense of unease settled over them. Jessica led the way, her excitement undiminished. As they turned a corner, they found themselves in what used to be the science lab. The room was filled with broken glass, overturned desks, and charred remnants of the fire. Jessica scanned the room with the camera, eager to capture any signs of the supernatural. "Did you guys hear that?" Daniel asked suddenly, his voice tense. They fell silent, straining to hear. A faint, rhythmic tapping echoed through the room, growing louder with each passing second. It sounded like someone or something was walking towards them. "Maybe it's just an animal," Jessica suggested, trying to keep her voice steady. But deep down, she knew it wasn't an animal. The tapping grew louder, and the temperature dropped further. Their breath turned to mist in the frigid air. "Let's get out of here," Megan pleaded, her eyes wide with fear. "Not yet," Jessica insisted, though her own fear was mounting. The door at the far end of the lab creaked open, and a figure emerged. It was a girl, her clothes charred and tattered, her face twisted in agony. Her eyes were hollow, and her mouth moved soundlessly, as if screaming. Jessica, frozen with terror, managed to lift the camera and film the apparition. The girl began to walk towards them, her movements jerky and unnatural. "We need to go now," Kyle shouted, snapping the group out of their trance. They turned and ran, the ghostly girl following close behind. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, and the tapping of her footsteps grew faster, more insistent. They reached the exit, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic set in as they pounded on it. Desperate to escape, the ghost was getting closer, her silent screams echoing in their ears. "Help! Somebody help us!" Daniel yelled, but there was no one to hear. The ghost reached out, her hand passing through Jessica's shoulder. Jessica screamed, feeling a searing pain as the icy touch burned through her. The others pulled at her, trying to drag her away, but the ghost held her in a death grip. "We can't leave her," Megan cried, tears streaming down her face. "We have to," Kyle shouted, his voice cracking with fear. But before they could decide, the ghost let go of Jessica and lunged at Megan. Megan stumbled back, her flashlight clattering to the floor. The ghost's hollow eyes locked onto hers, and Megan felt a wave of cold engulf her. "Run!" Megan managed to scream, and the others bolted. Jessica, Daniel, and Kyle fled down the hallway, their hearts pounding in their chests. They reached a window and smashed it open, scrambling through the broken glass to safety. As they stumbled into the sunlight, they turned back, expecting to see Megan following. But she was gone. The authorities were called, and the abandoned wing was sealed off for good. Megan's disappearance was ruled an accident, a tragic end to the school year. But Jessica, Daniel, and Kyle knew the truth. They had seen the ghost, felt her icy grip, and heard her silent screams. Years passed, but the memory of that day never faded. They kept in touch, bound by their shared trauma. They never spoke of what happened in the abandoned wing, but the scars remained. Elmwood High School moved on, but the ghost of the burned girl still haunted the halls, waiting for the next group of thrill-seekers to venture too close. The last day of school at Elmwood High was remembered not for the joy of graduation, but for the chilling reminder that some legends are real, and some spirits never find peace.
Welcome to our channel. Tonight, we bring you two spine-chilling tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. First, we explore the terrifying legend of an abandoned mansion that claimed the lives of 4 friends. Then, we'll take you deep into the haunted Blackwood Forest, where a cursed cabin holds dark secrets and a deadly fate. So, dim the lights, grab your popcorn, and get ready for a journey into the unknown. But be warned, these stories are not for the faint of heart. In the quiet town of Westbrook, nestled between dense forests and rolling hills, stood an ancient mansion abandoned for decades. The locals whispered tales of ghosts and curses, warning anyone who dared to venture near. But for Sarah, Mike, Julia, and Kevin, 4 college friends with a taste for adventure, it was the perfect spot for a thrilling night. One crisp autumn evening, they decided to test the town's legends. Armed with flashlights, snacks, and a couple of cameras to document their experience, they approached the mansion. As they drew closer, the air grew colder, and the sky seemed to darken. The house loomed before them, its windows like empty eyes staring into their souls. The front door creaked ominously as they pushed it open, revealing a grand but decaying foyer. Dust motes danced in the beams of their flashlights, which penetrated the grime-covered windows. "Welcome to our home for the night," Sarah announced with a grin, her voice echoing through the empty halls. They set up camp in what used to be the living room, a large space with a crumbling fireplace and torn wallpaper. The atmosphere was eerie, but they laughed off their nervousness, attributing it to the overactive imaginations of the townsfolk. As night fell, they gathered around a makeshift fire in the fireplace, sharing ghost stories and daring each other to explore the darker corners of the mansion. Mike, the biggest skeptic, scoffed at the idea of ghosts, but couldn't help feeling a chill run down his spine when he thought no one was looking around midnight. Julia suggested they split up and investigate different parts of the house to gather more footage. Sarah and Kevin headed upstairs, while Mike and Julia stayed on the ground floor. Sarah and Kevin wandered through the dusty corridors, their flashlights flickering as they picked up strange noises. They found themselves in a child's bedroom, filled with old toys and a small bed that looked untouched by time. Sarah felt a cold breeze brush past her, and she shivered. "Did you feel that?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Kevin nodded, his eyes wide. "Let's keep moving." Meanwhile, Mike and Julia explored the kitchen and dining room, finding nothing but broken dishes and rotten furniture. Mike, trying to lighten the mood, made a joke about the state of the place, but Julia didn't laugh. She had a bad feeling she couldn't shake. Suddenly, they heard a loud crash from the basement. They exchanged worried glances but decided to investigate. The basement door creaked open, revealing a steep staircase leading into darkness. With a deep breath, they descended, their flashlights casting long shadows on the damp walls dotted to the bottom. They found an old furnace and piles of forgotten junk. But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut, plunging them into pitch blackness. Julia screamed, and Mike pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge upstairs. Sarah and Kevin heard the scream and rushed to find their friends. They reached the basement door and tried to open it, but it seemed locked from the inside. Panic set in as they yelled for Mike and Julia, their voices echoing through the house in the basement. Julia and Mike huddled together, their breaths coming in short gasps. Suddenly, a faint glow appeared in the corner of the room. They turned to see a figure, transparent and ghostly, drifting toward them. Its eyes were hollow, and its mouth opened in a silent scream back upstairs. Sarah and Kevin managed to break down the door, only to find the basement empty. There was no sign of Mike or Julia. Desperation set in as they searched every corner of the mansion. But their friends had vanished without a trace. As dawn approached, Sarah and Kevin were exhausted and terrified. They decided to leave and get help. But as they stepped outside, the mansion's door slammed shut behind them. They ran to the car, but it wouldn't start. They were trapped. In the days that followed, the townspeople searched for the missing friends, but found no clues. The mansion remained silent, its secrets hidden within its crumbling walls. Sarah and Kevin were never seen again, and their disappearance became another dark legend, whispered among the locals. Years later, a new group of thrill-seekers arrived in Westbrook, eager to explore the haunted mansion. But as they approached the front door, they heard faint whispers warning them to stay away. Ignoring the warnings, they entered, unaware that they were walking into a trap set by the restless spirits of Sarah. Mike, Julia, and Kevin, the cycle of horror continued, as the mansion claimed more victims, feeding off their fear and despair. The friends' tragic fate served as a grim reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some places are best left undisturbed. Nestled deep within the sprawling Blackwood forest stood an old, decrepit cabin known to the locals as the Curse House. For decades, the villagers spoke in hushed tones about the disappearances and strange occurrences that plagued anyone who dared to venture too close. But for Peter, Emily, Mark, and Sophie, 4 childhood friends with a shared love of the paranormal, it was the ultimate challenge. One brisk October evening, they decided to uncover the truth behind the legends. Armed with flashlights, camping gear, and a video camera to document their findings, they set off into the dense, shadowy forest. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decay, and as they approached the cabin, an eerie silence fell over the group. The cabin, bathed in the dim light of the setting sun, loomed ominously before them. Its wooden walls were warped and splintered, and the windows were covered in grime, giving it the appearance of a haunted relic from another time. Peter, the most adventurous of the group, took the lead. "Welcome to our haunted abode," he said with a grin. Pushing open the creaking door, the interior was just as unsettling as the exterior. Cobwebs hung like curtains from the ceiling, and the air was stale and musty. An old dust-covered fireplace dominated one wall, and broken furniture lay scattered across the floor. "This place gives me the creeps," Sophie whispered, clutching Emily's arm. Emily, ever the skeptic, shrugged. "It's just an old cabin. Let's set up our gear and start exploring." They set up camp in the main room, lighting a small fire in the fireplace to ward off the chill. As night fell, they gathered around the flickering flames, sharing ghost stories and laughing nervously. But as the hours passed, the laughter faded, replaced by an uneasy silence around midnight. They decided to split up and explore the cabin. Peter and Emily ventured upstairs, while Mark and Sophie stayed on the ground floor. The upper level was a maze of narrow hallways and small, dark rooms. Peter led the way, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the peeling wallpaper dot in one of the rooms. They found an old, tattered journal. The pages were brittle and yellowed with age, but the writing was still legible. It belonged to a man named Elias Blackwood, the original owner of the cabin. As they read through the entries, a chilling story began to unfold. Elias had been a recluse, obsessed with the occult and dark rituals. The journal detailed his attempts to summon a powerful spirit to grant him eternal life. But something had gone terribly wrong. The final entry spoke of a curse unleashed upon the cabin and the surrounding forest. A curse that would trap any who entered downstairs. Mark and Sophie discovered a hidden cellar beneath a loose floorboard. The air was colder as they descended the narrow staircase, their flashlights barely piercing the darkness. The cellar was filled with strange symbols etched into the walls and a large, circular stone altar in the center of the room. This must be where Elias performed his rituals, Mark said, his voice trembling. Suddenly, the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut, plunging them into darkness. Sophie screamed, and Mark pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. A low, guttural growl echoed through the cellar, and they turned to see a shadowy figure emerging from the darkness upstairs. Peter and Emily heard the scream and rushed to find their friends. They reached the cellar door and tried to open it, but it seemed locked from the inside. Panic set in as they heard the growl and Sophie's terrified cries. "Hold on, we're coming," Peter shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor dot in the cellar. Mark and Sophie were paralyzed with fear as the figure drew closer. It was a twisted, malevolent spirit, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. It reached out with clawed hands, and Mark pushed Sophie behind him, trying to protect her. "Stay back," he shouted, but the spirit lunged forward, passing through him as if he were nothing. Mark collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, as Sophie backed into a corner, tears streaming down her face. Upstairs, Peter and Emily were desperate. They found a heavy iron rod and used it to pry open the cellar door. They rushed down the stairs, but it was too late. Mark lay motionless on the floor, and Sophie was nowhere to be found. "No, no, no," Emily cried, dropping to her knees beside Mark. She checked for a pulse, but there was none. He was gone. Peter shone his flashlight around the room, but the spirit had vanished, taking Sophie with it. They were alone in the darkness, with no idea what had happened to their friends. "We have to get out of here," Peter said, his voice shaking. "This place is cursed." They hurried back upstairs, but as they reached the main room, the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The windows rattled, and the walls seemed to close in around them. The cabin was alive. Feeding off their fear and despair, Emily grabbed the video camera and turned it on, desperate to document their last moments. If anyone finds this, please stay away from this place. It's evil. It took our friends, and it won't stop until it takes us too. Suddenly, the fire in the fireplace roared to life, the flames turning an unnatural shade of blue. The shadows danced and twisted, forming grotesque shapes that seemed to reach out for them. "We have to go now," Peter shouted, grabbing Emily's hand and pulling her toward the back door, but the cabin had other plans. The door frame warped and twisted, blocking their escape. The walls closed in, and the ceiling seemed to lower, pressing down on them. "Help! Somebody help us!" Emily screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive darkness. Peter and Emily clung to each other, their fear palpable. They could feel the cabin's malevolent energy feeding off their terror. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to thicken, enveloping them. In the end, the curse claimed them both. Their screams echoed through the forest, but no one was there to hear. The cabin stood silent once more, its secrets buried within its walls. Years passed, and the legend of the curse house grew. The locals warned their children to stay away, but the allure of the unknown was too strong for some. A new group of thrill-seekers arrived, eager to uncover the truth behind the legends. As they approached the cabin, they heard faint whispers warning them to turn back, but they ignored the signs, driven by curiosity and a desire for adventure. They stepped inside, unaware that they were walking into a trap set by the restless spirits of Peter, Emily, Mark, and Sophie. The cycle of horror continued as the cabin claimed more victims, feeding off their fear and despair. The friends' tragic fate served as a grim reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some places are best left undisturbed. In the quiet town of Ashwood, nestled between dense forests and rolling hills, there was an old mansion that had stood abandoned for decades. The locals whispered tales of ghosts and curses, warning anyone who dared to venture near. But for Emily, Tom, Sarah, and Jake, 4 college friends with a taste for adventure, it was the perfect spot for a weekend of thrills and chills. Emily, always the fearless leader, proposed the idea of spending a night in the mansion to see if the legends were true. The group, eager for an adrenaline rush, agreed without hesitation. They packed their bags with snacks, flashlights, and a couple of cameras to document their experience. As they approached the mansion on a crisp autumn afternoon, the air grew colder and the sky seemed to darken. The house loomed over them, its windows like empty eyes staring into their souls. The front door creaked ominously as they pushed it open, revealing a grand but decaying foyer. Dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight that managed to penetrate the grime-covered windows. "Welcome to our home for the night," Emily announced with a grin, her voice echoing through the empty halls. They set up camp in what used to be the living room, a large space with a crumbling fireplace and torn wallpaper. The atmosphere was eerie, but they laughed off their nervousness, attributing it to the overactive imaginations of the townsfolk. As night fell, they gathered around a makeshift fire in the fireplace, sharing ghost stories and daring each other to explore the darker corners of the mansion. Tom, the biggest skeptic, scoffed at the idea of ghosts but couldn't help feeling a chill run down his spine when he thought no one was looking. Around midnight, Sarah suggested they split up and investigate. different parts of the house to gather. More footage. Emily and Jake headed upstairs, while Sarah and Tom stayed on the ground floor. Emily and Jake wandered through the dusty corridors, their flashlights flickering as they picked up strange noises. They found themselves in a child's bedroom, filled with old toys and a small bed that looked untouched by time. Emily felt a cold breeze brush past her, and she shivered. "Did you feel that?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Jake nodded, his eyes wide. "Let's keep moving." Meanwhile, Sarah and Tom explored the kitchen and dining room, finding nothing but broken dishes and rotten furniture. Tom, trying to lighten the mood, made a joke about the state of the place, but Sarah didn't laugh. She had a bad feeling she couldn't shake. Suddenly, they heard a loud crash from the basement. They exchanged worried glances but decided to investigate. The basement door creaked open, revealing a steep staircase leading into darkness. With a deep breath, they descended, their flashlights casting long shadows on the damp walls. At the bottom, they found an old furnace and piles of forgotten junk. But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut, plunging them into pitch blackness. Sarah screamed, and Tom pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. Upstairs, Emily and Jake heard the scream and rushed to find their friends. They reached the basement door and tried to open it, but it seemed locked from the inside. Panic set in as they yelled for Sarah and Tom, their voices echoing through the house. In the basement, Sarah and Tom huddled together, their breaths coming in short gasps. Suddenly, a faint glow appeared in the corner of the room. They turned to see a figure, transparent and ghostly, drifting towards them. Its eyes were hollow, and its mouth opened in a silent scream. Back upstairs, Emily and Jake managed to break down the door, only to find the basement empty. There was no sign of Sarah or Tom. Desperation set in as they searched every corner of the mansion, but their friends had vanished without a trace. As dawn approached, Emily and Jake were exhausted and terrified. They decided to leave and get help, but as they stepped outside, the mansion's door slammed shut behind them. They ran to the car, but it wouldn't start. They were trapped. In the days that followed, the townspeople searched for the missing friends, but found no clues. The mansion remained silent, its secrets hidden within its crumbling walls. Emily and Jake were never seen again, and their disappearance became another dark legend whispered among the locals. Years later, a new group of thrill-seekers arrived in Ashwood, eager to explore the haunted mansion. But as they approached the front door, they heard faint whispers warning them to stay away. Ignoring the warnings, they entered, unaware that they were walking into a trap set by the restless spirits of Emily, Tom, Sarah, and Jake. The cycle of horror continued, as the mansion claimed more victims, feeding off their fear and despair. The friends' tragic fate served as a grim reminder that some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some places are best left undisturbed. In the heart of an ancient, forgotten forest, there lay a village abandoned for over a century. This place, shrouded in mist and mystery, was known as Blackwood. Locals from nearby towns whispered about it, speaking of curses and vanished souls. But to four adventurous friends, it was the perfect place for an unforgettable weekend. Max, the leader of the group, had always been drawn to the supernatural. His fascination was shared by his girlfriend, Emily, and their close friends, Jake and Lisa, equipped with camping gear, cameras, and a sense of excitement. They set off one early morning, eager to explore the enigma of Blackwood. Upon arriving, the village seemed almost normal, despite its dilapidated state. The air was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and distant caw of crows. The group decided to set up camp in the village's largest building, a decrepit manor house that once belonged to the village elder. As night fell, they gathered around a campfire inside the mansion's grand hall, telling ghost stories and laughing nervously. But as the hour grew late, a chill seemed to permeate the room, and the fire flickered ominously. Emily, feeling uneasy, suggested they call it a night. They retreated to their sleeping bags, but sleep did not come easily. Strange noises echoed through the manor creaks, whispers and the distant sound of footsteps. At first, they tried to ignore it, convincing themselves it was the old building settling. But when a loud crash reverberated through the hall, they all sat up, hearts pounding. Max grabbed a flashlight and motioned for everyone to follow. They crept down the long corridors, the beam of light dancing across peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. They found the source of the noise in a small, dusty room. An old mirror had fallen from the wall, shattering into pieces. Yet, in the fractured reflection, they saw something that made their blood run cold, shadowy figures standing behind them. Turning quickly, they found nothing but darkness. Anxiety hung heavy in the air as they returned to the main hall. They tried to shake off the fear, blaming it on their imaginations and the spooky atmosphere. But deep down, each of them felt an unspoken dread. The next day, they explored the village, discovering remnants of lives once lived, tattered clothes, rusted tools, and faded photographs. In the village square stood a peculiar statue, a tall figure cloaked in a hood, its face obscured. The inscription read, "To the Keeper of Souls." It sent shivers down their spines. That evening, as they reviewed the footage from their cameras, they saw something inexplicable. In several frames, shadowy apparitions flitted in and out of view, always at the edge of the light. Lisa, the skeptic of the group, insisted it was a trick of the light or a camera glitch. But Jake, whose grandmother had told him many tales of spirits and curses, was less sure. Tension grew as night descended once more. This time, the noises were louder, more insistent. A sense of impending doom filled the air. Emily felt it most strongly, her intuition screaming at her to leave. She voiced her fears, but Max, ever the adventurer, convinced everyone to stay. They decided to sleep in shifts, ensuring someone was always awake to watch for anything unusual. Around midnight, while Jake was on watch, he heard a faint sobbing. He followed the sound to a small room at the end of the hall, where he found an old journal. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but he could make out the words of the village elder, recounting the day the curse began. It spoke of a ritual gone wrong, a plea for protection that turned into a binding of souls. The village had been doomed ever since, haunted by restless spirits. As Jake read the final entry, a cold hand gripped his shoulder. He spun around, but there was no one there. The journal slipped from his hands as he raced back to the hall, his face pale with fear. He tried to explain what he had read, but before he could finish, the manor was plunged into darkness. The fire extinguished, and their flashlights flickered and died. Panic set in. They huddled together, trying to remain calm. But the air grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. The shadows seemed to move, encircling them. Suddenly, the front door slammed open, and a fierce wind blew through the hall. In the dim moonlight, they saw the hooded figure from the statue standing in the doorway. Max shouted for everyone to run. They bolted through the manor, stumbling over debris, hearts pounding with terror. They burst out into the open air, but the village seemed different. The paths twisted in unfamiliar ways. The trees loomed closer, and the mist thickened. Separated in the chaos, Emily found herself alone, calling out for the others. The whispers grew louder, now forming words. "Join us." She stumbled into the village square, where the statue now stood with its hood thrown back, revealing a ghastly skeletal face. She screamed, but no sound came out. Meanwhile, Max, Jake, and Lisa regrouped near the edge of the village. They could hear Emily's cries but couldn't see her through the thick fog. Max, driven by fear and determination, led them back towards the square. As they approached, they saw Emily standing motionless before the statue. The hooded figure reached out a skeletal hand toward her. Max charged forward, shouting her name. The figure turned its hollow gaze toward him, and the air grew colder still. With a final, desperate effort, he grabbed Emily's hand and pulled her away. The fog began to recede, and the village seemed to shift around them. They ran without looking back, their breaths ragged, until they burst through the forest's edge and found themselves on the road, where their journey had begun. Behind them, Blackwood was hidden once more in the mist, as if it had never existed. Shaken and exhausted, they vowed never to return. The experience left them haunted by nightmares and unanswered questions. What had they disturbed in Blackwood? What ancient force had they awakened? Max, Emily, Jake, and Lisa never spoke of that weekend again, but the fear lingered in their eyes. They knew that some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some places are better left undisturbed. The shadows of Blackwood would remain with them forever, a chilling reminder of the unknown lurking just beyond the edge of reality. In the years that followed, they drifted apart, each dealing with the trauma in their way. Max became a recluse, spending his days researching ancient curses and supernatural phenomena, desperate to find answers. Emily threw herself into her work, trying to forget the horrors she had witnessed. Jake, plagued by nightmares, turned to therapy and spiritual guidance, seeking peace. Lisa, ever the skeptic, struggled to reconcile her rational mind with the inexplicable events she had experienced. But none of them could shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the shadows of Blackwood had followed them home. Occasionally, they would hear whispers in the night or catch glimpses of figures in the corner of their vision. The curse of Blackwood had left its mark, a dark stain on their souls that could never be erased. And so, the story of Blackwood became a legend, a tale whispered among those who dared to seek the unknown. The village remained hidden, its secrets guarded by the mist and the spirits that dwelled within. The fate of the lost souls and the true nature of the curse were mysteries that would never be fully unraveled, lost to the shadows and the passage of time. Welcome to our chilling adventure into the unknown. Tonight, we delve into the spine-tingling tale of John, an avid hiker who ventured into a mysterious forest known for its dark legends and unsettling occurrences. Armed with nothing but his gear and a fearless spirit, John set out to explore a place where reality and myth intertwine. What began as a routine camping trip soon escalated into a harrowing encounter with something beyond comprehension. Join us as we unravel this eerie story of courage, fear, and the unknown. Be prepared, this is not just another hike in the woods. John was an avid hiker and loved spending time in nature. He always sought out new places for his hikes and explored the most remote corners of forests. His friends often joked that he was probably a bear in his past life. This time, John decided to venture into a forest about which he had heard many legends and myths. The locals claimed that strange things happened there, but John, as always, didn't believe in tales and legends. His backpack was carefully packed. A tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and of course, a flashlight and knife. John knew that anything could happen in the forest and was prepared for any difficulties. He chose a secluded spot where he planned to set up camp and set off. Early in the morning, the forest greeted him with silence and coolness. Tall trees created a dense shade, and sunlight barely broke through the canopy. John walked along a narrow path, enjoying the nature and feeling how with each step he was moving further and further away from civilization. He heard the singing of birds and the rustle of leaves underfoot, and it soothed him. After walking several kilometers, John found the perfect spot for his camp. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall trees, with a small stream flowing nearby. He quickly set up his tent, built a fire, and prepared lunch. The evening promised to be quiet and peaceful. John sat by the fire, watching the dancing flames and listening to the sounds of the forest. Night fell quickly, bringing darkness with it. The forest, which seemed so friendly during the day, transformed at night. The sounds became more muted, and it seemed that the darkness concealed something sinister. John was not one to easily succumb to fear. He knew that the forest at night was a place where one could hear many strange sounds. Cries of night birds, rustling leaves, animal noises. He sat calmly by the fire, sipping hot tea from a thermos when he suddenly heard something unusual. It was a quiet but distinct rustling sound coming from the depths of the forest. John listened, but the sound quickly faded. He decided it was probably just animals and continued enjoying his evening. However, a few minutes later, the rustling repeated. This time closer and louder. John tensed. He stood up and directed his flashlight towards the sound. The beam of light cut through the trees, illuminating the thick foliage, but he saw nothing unusual. The sound ceased, and John sat back by the fire, but his peace was disturbed, and he began to listen intently to every sound. Time passed. The night grew darker, and the rustling continued. It seemed that someone or something was sneaking around his camp, remaining unseen. John picked up his flashlight again and slowly walked around the camp, trying to find the source of the sounds. But the forest seemed empty. Returning to the fire, he felt a strange sense of unease. Something was wrong, and he knew it. He heard the rustling again, this time very close, and his heart started pounding harder. For a long time, they found nothing unusual. But then one of his friends noticed something strange. On the ground were tracks that couldn't belong to a human or an animal. Huge footprints led deeper into the forest. The friends decided to follow them, hoping to find more evidence. The tracks led them further and further until they came across an old, abandoned cabin. The cabin was covered in moss and looked very old. They went inside and found many strange symbols drawn on the walls. In a corner lay old books and items that resembled ritualistic objects. It seemed that this place had been abandoned long ago, but the tracks led directly here. They began exploring the cabin, taking photos and recording everything they saw. At one point, one of the friends noticed fresh tracks on the floor leading to the back door. They followed them and emerged into a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. In the center of the clearing stood the very creature John had seen. It was enormous, covered in black fur, standing motionless and staring at them. The friends froze in horror, not knowing what to do. The creature didn't move, but its presence was terrifying. One of the friends tried to take a step forward, but the creature let out a loud roar, and they all stepped back. John and his friends froze in terror, not knowing what to do. The creature didn't move, but its roar paralyzed them with fear. Finally, one of the friends suggested retreating and returning to the car. But as they began to slowly back away, the creature took a step forward. John realized there was no time to think. He grabbed his friend's hand and pulled him along, shouting at the others to run. The group dashed away from the clearing, hearing the creature's heavy footsteps behind them. Panic engulfed everyone as they ran. Heedless of the path, the forest seemed endless, with each turn revealing new obstacles. John constantly looked back to ensure all his friends were following. However, one of them, Tom, had fallen behind, tripping over a tree root. John stopped to help him, but the creature was too close. Tom tried to stand, but his legs gave way from fear and exhaustion. The creature caught up with him, and John heard his scream of terror before the forest swallowed the sounds again. John's heart broke with guilt and helplessness, but he knew he had to keep running to save the others. The remaining group emerged into a small clearing where their car was parked. John shouted at his friends to get in quickly, but the creature was already approaching. They managed to scramble into the car and start the engine just as they saw the creature break out of the forest. The car sped away, leaving the terrifying creature behind. The friends drove in silence, each lost in their own thoughts and feelings. They understood they had lost Tom, and this feeling haunted them all the way home. John was devastated. He felt guilty for bringing his friends to that forest and for not being able to save Tom. He knew his life would never be the same, and the memories of that night would haunt him for the rest of his days. Returning to town, they reported the incident to the authorities, but their story seemed too incredible. The police conducted an investigation, but found no traces of the creature or Tom. John and his friends became outcasts, considered crazy, and no one believed their tale. Time passed, but John couldn't come to terms with the loss. He kept returning to that forest, trying to find any answers. Each time he came back empty-handed, but his belief that what happened was real never faded. One night, John decided to return to the cabin alone. He felt he needed to finish what he had started. The night was dark and moonless, and the forest greeted him with a grim silence. John walked along familiar paths. Feeling fear gradually take hold of him, he found the cabin and entered. Everything was in its place, just as it had been the day they first found it. John began searching for clues that could lead him to answers, but it was all in vain. Suddenly, he heard a familiar rustling behind him. He turned around and saw the creature standing in the doorway. It looked at him with the same empty eyes, and John felt fear engulf him. He realized this was the end. The creature stepped forward, and John felt his willpower leave him in his last moments. John thought about his friends and Tom. He knew they wouldn't forget him and would remember what he tried to do. John closed his eyes, and the creature took the final step the next morning. The police found his backpack and personal belongings at the cabin, but John himself was never found. His disappearance became another dark legend about that forest, and locals said the spirits of the forest took him for trying to uncover their secrets. Time passed, but the memory of John and his friends lived on in the hearts of those who knew them. The forest remained a dark and mysterious place, and everyone who dared to enter it felt enveloped by fear and anxiety. John's story became a warning to all who sought to learn more about nature's secrets. The forest and its inhabitants preferred to remain in the shadows, and attempts to penetrate their world could have tragic consequences. Thus ended the life of John, the brave explorer who became a victim of his love for nature and desire to uncover its secrets. His name became a legend, but his fate remained an eternal mystery. Hidden in the dark forests,